Pardon the slightly more casual dress in the video. I'm doing this during the great snow and ice week. The second exam will be identical to the first exam in that it will be 40 multiple choice questions. We have 5 chapters in this section, so you can expect about 8 questions per chapter. And like they were on the first exam, they will be really trying to test your ability to apply the definitions and the concepts more so than just spit them right back at me. So now let's dive into Chapter 5, Competitive Dynamics. Important that you understand who sees themselves as a competitor. And then we get into the textbook definition. In terms of who we see as a competitor, they talk about market commonality. Are you going after the same people? Do you touch in lots of different places? Resource similarity. Again, I think one of the questions really tries to trigger this idea of resource similarity. In the real world, you don't see that too much. No specific question about awareness, motivation, and capability, but these thoughts underlie a lot of the questions. And remember that the outcome of competitive attack is usually to improve your market position. Almost always it will grow your market share. But unfortunately, it's not as automatic that you'll increase your financial performance. Make sure you understand the difference between a tactical and a strategic competitive action and what's likely to happen in the wake of those. This chart has lots of things in there that you need to understand. Make sure you're up on the concept of multi-market contact, how it tends to de-escalate actions, but if you have high multi-market contact, it's almost sure to generate a response if someone does something because it means so much to them. There is 1 or 2 questions about first mover, second mover, and late mover. So make sure that you're up on when do these tend to work for each other and what are the characteristics of first and second movers. No explicit questions about market speed. I'm not a big believer in that concept. I think those words appear in some of the answers, but understanding them is never important. And then I do think it's important that you understand the overall strategy of competitive behavior. There's a question about this. I know because it's not in the book, I'm going to go over this again in a little bit more detail. The idea of who you're attacking and how aggressively you're going at it. So if you remember, we went through the exercise in class where we looked at the advertising campaigns and budgets of the major insurance companies, auto and home insurance companies, and I would say that was definitely a skirmish. The outcome is really indeterminate, and if you ask them all why they're advertising, they would probably say because our competitors are advertising. Nobody's really trying to gain a particular advantage here. A war is when 2 near peers go at it all out. These don't happen very often. You could argue right now Walmart and Amazon are at war to be a leading online retailer. And again, eventually, the outcome of a war, you hope to basically vanquish your rival and kind of move them down into this block, which is to say that they are less strong than you. You really wound them with this. The dominate is the interesting one. If you remember, I talked about the fact that Microsoft rescued Apple, even though they were a dominated competitor. The thing about a dominated competitor is they really don't offer any threat, but the advantage of leaving a dominated competitor in the marketplace is it creates this false perception of competition, and that false perception of competition tends to keep customers happy. In other words, it doesn't look like one company is monopolizing the industry, even though in reality they kind of are. And also it tends to keep new entrants out because it looks like there's plenty of competition. And then defeat, this is when somebody takes on a weaker rival and the outcome is just to flat beat them out of the market. Talked about that. And then again, if you understand the principles behind these concepts, that's going to help you answer several of the questions. On to corporate strategies in Chapter 6. And so remember, these are the fundamental questions of corporate strategy. The big concept, one of the big concepts you need to be all over is this idea of synergy. And remember, I'm not going to test you that you know the knowledge of these things. Particularly, I hate the related constrained and the related linked. I cannot keep those things straight. Known, dominant, business, and unrelated, those show up in other places in this chart. So those are words you're going to want to be familiar with. Anyway, big concept that I'm going to ask you about, a total of 3 questions about in different directions, is this idea of synergy and the better off test. In other words, if you remember our example of Pepsi and Frito-Lay, why is Pepsi better because it has Frito-Lay, and why is Frito-Lay better because it has Pepsi? And like I used to illustrate it, it's not clear to a lot of people that they really are, and that fails the synergy test, which is to say that they're better off together than they would be apart, or you're adding 2 things and you're not getting a 3, you're only getting a 2 or maybe even a 1.5. Very important that you understand economies of scope. One question about market power, a very important concept to understand is unrelated diversification as well. Economies of scope, this is where you try to get synergy. You get synergy by sharing core competencies or by sharing stuff. And there's going to be a couple of questions. They're going to see whether you can recognize that in examples. Again, you don't need to worry about this chart other than make sure you know what unrelated diversification is. There's no questions where you would need to understand what our discussion, or let me rephrase that. There's no questions where you need to remember details of P&G, GE, Tiffany's, or Danaher down the line, but you do need to understand the concepts. Remember that when we talk about market power, I told you about how Tiffany's bought a diamond mine. It's a classic example of vertical integration where they went back and they entered a supplier's business. You do that to take out cost, to try to gain greater control. And particularly if you have a problem with a supplier, such you don't think their quality was good, it allows you greater control of your quality. Now, pooled power, this comes where just from the standpoint of being big, you tend to get control over, or more power, I should say, not control, but more power over either your suppliers because they need you, or your buyers because they need you. You're one of the few options. Unrelated diversification, several questions. Make sure you understand the principle that they're not trying to share things. In some limited cases, they do, in fact, have management leadership as a core competency, but even then, that's shared from the parent down to the companies, not across the companies. And make sure that you understand efficient internal markets and why these firms think they should be better at resource allocation. There's a specific question on that. Again, nothing specifically about Danaher or Vista Equity, even though they're both very cool companies. There is one question that talks about why managers sometimes like to do the diversification, and that gets into the bad reasons to diversify that's covered up on this slide. Make sure that you're aware of that. That's it for Chapter 6. On to Chapter 7 and mergers and acquisitions. Make sure that you know these 3 terms because that's going to help you decode some of the questions. Don't need to remember anything about this. Do remember that there are 3 basic logics or economic rationales for mergers and acquisitions, and that they're different. There's going to be a question where you're going to have to spot which logic is in play. In terms of the benefits, remember that consolidation typically is based around cost savings and market power. Be very familiar with these terms to understand what a horizontal acquisition would mean, what a vertical acquisition would mean. Especially keeping those concepts straight are going to help you with several questions. Mergers and acquisitions is extensions. New geographic markets is pretty obvious, but remember too that a lot of companies do acquisitions to buy the new product lineup. And in theory, it's lower risk and lower cost because you already have the product developed, but that's not always true, although you may not want to remember that it's not always true for the test questions. But you have the price that you pay of you tend to gut your own R&D capability when you do that. M&A is entrepreneurship. This is when you're really trying to grow something new. We won't have any questions about our in-class discussion of this, but again, the principles will help you. Very important that you understand the M&A process and why they don't go well. When you overpay, at a minimum, when you overpay, you pay too much for it, and it's going to be hard for you to justify that price. Sometimes, not always, that leads to taking on too much debt. And I think those are the main things to understand. Again, this chart will help you keep answers straight. This chart will also help you spot with some of the questions that will just help you know what's a good thing to do and what's not a good thing to do. And then in restructuring, make sure that you're familiar with why downsizing is seen as typically not the way to go, and sometimes why restructuring can aid your performance. And this chart is a good summary of that. That's it for Chapter 7. Chapter 8, Global, no questions here. Do understand the discussion of regionalization from the textbook. And again, this was all designed to get your attention. No test questions there. I would be very on top of the incentives and the basic benefits for the exam. This makes sense, but there's no test question on it. These questions will help you keep the different strategies straight, but there's no test question that asks you what are the big questions. It's going to be very important for the exam that you are up on what is the definition of these things, not that you need to spit it back at me, but understanding the differences between these three is going to be important, and then also knowing the pros and the cons of these three is going to be important. And that happens, we talked about that in class, using these three slides. Entry strategies, know the pros and the cons of these. I would particularly pay attention to these, or there's a question about franchising, and there's a question about why would I pick a given strategy because it works well. Make sure you understand the liability of foreignness and also the economic risk. Understand what happens to manufacturing companies when their home currency fluctuates. So much for Chapter 8. Lastly, for Chapter 9 and alliances, understand that companies do these alliances largely because they're trying to get the same benefits of an M&A without the cost. So in many cases, it's trying to develop economies of scope without the permanent type of lash up. Understand how an alliance is different than an M&A and how it's easier to unwind than an M&A. I do want you to understand these three definitions or terms very well because they're such pivotal terms to understanding the nature of the alliance. Nothing in particular off of this chart. And again, I'm not real big on these different speed cycles, but reading these rationales is going to help you answer some of the test questions. By all means, be very familiar with these terms and the difference between vertical and horizontal because that will help you with the exam. Nothing specific about any of these. Franchising is the only thing you need to worry about on this slide. I don't really believe in those concepts. Notice that we didn't talk about the things on those pages. Risks and alliances, understand why they come undone. The idea of opportunism is going to be very good. And then how to succeed in understanding the importance of how you approach contracts and then how you commit to things. I don't think there's a specific test question that asks you over this, but if you keep this in mind, it's going to help you with some of the other test questions. And if you talk about what's one of the biggest downside in my mind to all of the benefits of an alliance is, it comes at the loss of control and visibility of some key aspects because you don't have as much insight into what's going on. So that's it for the exam review. Sorry it's so long, but It's a little bit lot more material on this. Again, 40 multiple choice questions, same rules as always. You can have a one-page cheat sheet. If you use Respondus Monitor due to whatever conditions, then make sure that you do an excellent environmental check, or I'm going to deduct points for that. Good luck.